What if I told you the scale is lying to you? Hidden beneath the surface, there's an active organ, silently rewriting your chemistry. It's time to stop chasing symptoms and start correcting the source. Let's calibrate your biology today.
Right now, today, there are millions of men walking around with perfectly healthy, or what they think are perfectly healthy body mass indices.
Right.
But they actually have the testosterone levels of a 70-year-old.
Yeah, it's completely wild.
They're exhausted. Their moods are just flatlining. They're losing muscle mass. And then they finally, drag themselves into their doctor's office.
And we know exactly how that goes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're told they're perfectly fine. The doctor looks at the chart and says, hey, your weight is normal. Your blood sugar isn't quite diabetic yet.
Right.
So they get sent home with a pat on the back, maybe an antidepressant, and they're basically told that getting older just feels this way. Well, today, we are exposing that medical illusion. We are unpacking the hidden toxic factory inside the male body that is silently destroying male hormones.
It's honestly a massive blind spot in modern medicine right now. For decades, we've just looked at body fat as passive storage, like a biological pantry,
Yeah, you eat too much, it goes in the pantry.
Exactly. You eat too many calories, your body boxes them up, puts them in the pantry around your waist, and saves them for a famine. But when we look at the latest literature, that pantry is actually an active, malicious endocrine organ.
Wow.
It is working around the clock, producing chemicals that actively sabotage a man's natural physiological systems.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are exploring what some researchers are, they're quietly referring to it as the testosterone apocalypse.
It's an intense term, but it fits.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
And to do this, we are looking at a stack of incredibly rigorous sources. We have two separate medical studies pulling from the NYINI's database. That's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which analyzed thousands of American men.
Massive data sets.
Huge. And they synthesized a massive PRISMA meta-analysis of over 5,000 men.
Yeah, and we should clarify for the listener, these are not your typical fitness magazine articles.
No, definitely not.
We are going to be wading into PhD and MD level endocrinology today. We're looking at heavy statistical modeling, deep physiological mechanisms, cross-sectional population data.
So if you're listening to this and you're expecting a superficial, just eat your vegetables and do some push-ups, kind of deep dive, buckle up. We're going deep into the cellular weeds here.
Because we have to. You can't fix it if you don't understand it.
Exactly. We want to understand the exact mechanisms, the why and the how behind this hormonal collapse. So whether you are a clinician looking to update your treatment paradigms, or just a man wanting to understand why you feel fatigued despite having a normal body weight, this deep dive is going to fundamentally change how you view your body.
I really think the best place to start is by tearing down the metric that has been misleading doctors and patients for the better part of a century, the BMI.
Oh man, the BMI.
Yeah. These papers provide the hard data to prove just how useless it can be when we're trying to assess hormonal health.
Let's talk about the body mass index, because we've all experienced it. You step on the scale at the clinic, the nurse measures your height, and the computer spits out this 2-digit number.
Right, the golden number.
Right. And for my entire adult life, a BMI under 25 has been held up as the absolute gold standard for health. Under 25, you are safe. Over 25, overweight. Over 30, obese. It's so binary. But our sources are telling us this is a catastrophic oversimplification. Why is this math equation suddenly the bad guy?
Well, to understand why it's flawed, you really have to look at where it came from. The math equation for BMI, taking your weight in kilograms and dividing it by your height in meters squared, it was actually created in the 19th century.
Wait, the 19th century?
Yes, by a Belgian astronomer named Adolphe Quetelet.
An astronomer, not a doctor.
Exactly. He wasn't a physician. He was a statistician trying to find the mathematical average man for population studies. It was never designed to be a diagnostic tool for individual metabolic health.
That is wild. We are using an astronomer's math from the 1800s to diagnose modern endocrine issues.
Right. And the fundamental flaw is that it simply cannot tell the difference between a pound of dense, metabolically active muscle tissue and a pound of highly inflammatory belly fat. To the BMI, mass is just mass.
So if a guy spends 5 days a week in the gym lifting heavy weights, He might weigh 200 pounds.
Hmm.
His BMI is going to classify him as borderline obese.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though his body fat percentage might be in the single digits.
Right. And the medical community did recognize this flaw eventually. So, as a backup, doctors started relying heavily on waist circumference, the tape measure.
Right, the classic physical test.
Yeah. The standard clinical guideline became, aim for a waist under 102 centimeters, which is roughly 40 inches.
Okay, so keep it under 40 inches and you're safe.
Supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
If your waist is under 40 inches, you're supposedly clear of metabolic danger.
Mm.
But the sources we're looking at today point out that even the tape measure has severe limitations.
Well, I'd assume the limitation is that the tape measure is only telling you the circumference of the cylinder, right? Like, it has absolutely no way of telling you what is actually inside the cylinder.
That is exactly the crux of the issue. A large waist could be driven by a few different things. It could be subcutaneous fat.
Which is what, exactly?
That's the soft, squishy fat located right underneath the skin. You can pinch it. Now, it might not look great in a swimsuit, but metabolically speaking, subcutaneous fat is relatively benign.
Okay, so it's not the enemy.
Not really. Alternatively, a large waist could be the result of massive, dense abdominal wall muscles. Or, crucially, it could be visceral fat.
And here we go, the toxic factory.
Yes, this is the hard, toxic fat that weaves itself deep inside your abdominal cavity. It wraps around your liver, it basically strangles your pancreas, and it weaves all through your intestines.
So if BMI is broken and a tape measure is effectively blind to what's going on inside, how do we actually find this toxic fat? Because the researchers in the Sudal study, they threw out BMI entirely.
They did.
They used something called the Visceral Adiposity Index, or VAI. What exactly makes VAI a better tool?
VAI is brilliant because it moves beyond just physical geometry. It's a mathematical model that calculates not just fat distribution, but fat function.
Yeah.
It uses your BMI and your waist circumference as a baseline, but then it mixes in biochemical blood markers, specifically your fasting triglycerides and your HDL.
Your high-density lipoprotein, the good cholesterol.
Exactly.
Wait, but why those two blood markers specifically? How does cholesterol in my blood tell you where the fat is stored in my belly?
Because visceral fat doesn't just sit there like a dormant lump. It actively dysregulates your bloodstream. Think of triglycerides as the unburned fuel sloshing around in your blood.
Okay.
When you have high visceral fat, that fat becomes insulin resistant. It starts leaking this unburned fuel into your system, driving triglycerides way up.
I see.
And at the same time, HDL acts as the garbage trucks of the bloodstream, pulling bad cholesterol out of circulation. Visceral fat actively suppresses your body's ability to maintain high HDL levels.
So it's flooding the streets with trash and firing the garbage men.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Yes. So by combining the physical measurements with high triglycerides and low HDL, the VAI isn't just estimating the size of your belly. It is measuring the biochemical panic happening inside your adipose tissue.
That makes perfect sense. It's reading the exhaust fumes of the fat, not just the size of the gas tank.
Exactly.
But the Friedel and Potter study, the other one we looked at, they took it a step further, didn't they? They didn't even rely on math or blood tests to estimate the fat. They used actual imaging.
They used DXA scans, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. This is highly sophisticated clinical imaging. The Friedel and Potter study analyzed over 4,400 men.
That's a massive sample size for imaging.
Huge. And instead of guessing how much visceral fat was there based on blood work, they used these specialized X-rays to look inside the abdominal cavity and directly measure the physical area of visceral adipose tissue, or VAT, in square centimeters. There were no proxies. They took a direct visual measurement of the hidden fat.
Which leads to a finding in these papers that, it absolutely stopped me in my tracks. They talk about something called discordance phenotypes.
Yes.
Basically, they're looking at men whose outside appearance completely contradicts their internal health. Walk us through this, because it totally shatters the illusion of the healthy, skinny guy.
The discordance phenotype is the exact reason BMI is failing us. When researchers looked at the DXA data, they found a massive cohort of men who had a perfectly normal BMI, under 25.
Right.
By all classical medical standards, these men were healthy.
Right, they look great on paper.
But when they measured their visceral fat, it was sky high. This is what we colloquially call being skinny fat. And when they checked the testosterone levels of these normal weight, skinny fat men, the numbers were an absolute disaster.
How bad are we talking?
Their testosterone levels were comparable to, and in many cases even lower than, men who were clinically obese but happened to have low visceral fat.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. I really want to make sure I'm grasping this. You can have a guy who is medically classified as obese carrying 50 extra pounds, and he can have better, higher testosterone levels than a guy who fits into a size 32 pair of jeans.
Absolutely.
How is that biologically possible?
Because it comes down to where the body prefers to store the excess energy. If the obese man is genetically predisposed to store his excess calories as subcutaneous fat again, that soft, pinchable fat under the skin, his endocrine system remains relatively insulated from the damage.
Because it's not the toxic factory fat.
Right. The subcutaneous fat is mostly just baggage. It's heavy, but it's quiet. But the skinny guy in the size 32 jeans, his body might be highly sensitive to stress or poor diet, causing him to store a small, highly concentrated amount of fat directly around his organs.
Just packed right in there.
Yeah. The studies show that normal weight men with high visceral fat had 28% to 36% lower testosterone than normal weight men with low visceral fat. The total weight on the scale is utterly irrelevant. The fat distribution is the true biological marker of health.
The sources use a really vivid analogy here that I think crystallizes this perfectly. They compare a sumo wrestler to an average office worker.
It's a fascinating comparison. I mean, if you run a sumo wrestler or an elite rugby forward through a standard medical computer, the BMI will scream that they are morbidly obese.
Right, because they weigh 300 pounds.
Exactly. Their waistlines are massive. But when sports scientists actually run these athletes through DXA scans or MRIs during their peak training seasons, the imaging reveals something incredible. Their abdominal mass is dominated by thick, powerful slabs of core muscle layered with a massive amount of subcutaneous fat.
Okay.
But underneath all that, they actually have remarkably low levels of the toxic visceral fat.
Really? Despite all that size?
Yes. Because of their intense physical training, their metabolisms are highly efficient at keeping the fat away from the organs. As a result, their insulin sensitivity is excellent, and their hormonal profiles, including testosterone, are incredibly robust.
And the tragic flip side of that coin is the office worker phenotype. We all know this guy. I mean, he's 35, 40 years old. He hasn't lifted a weight or done a sprint in 10 years.
Right.
He sits in a chair for 10 hours a day, drinks a few IPAs on the weekend, and eats a standard Western diet. But because he doesn't eat massive quantities of food, he looks totally normal in a suit.
His BMI is a perfect 24.
Exactly. But when he takes off his shirt, he has that hard, protruding little gut. He probably jokes that it's just a dad bod.
Yeah.
But internally, his endocrine system is effectively 65 years old.
Precisely. His BMI gives him a false sense of security. But his visceral fat is quietly orchestrating a hormonal catastrophe.
Now, the math proves this is happening, but math alone doesn't cause testosterone to drop. Before we get into the biology of how this happens, I really want to dig into these statistical models.
Let's do it.
Because the mission of this deep dive requires us to look at the PhD and MD level analysis. We need to know for sure that this correlation isn't just some statistical fluke or a poorly designed survey.
The foundations of these studies are rock solid. Both heavily rely on the NDNE database. And N80s is essentially the gold standard for this kind of epidemiological research in the United States.
It's not just a phone survey, right? People aren't just guessing their weight.
Oh, not at all. The CDC sends mobile examination centers, literal fleets of high-tech trailers across the country. They bring participants in, physically measure them, draw their blood, and run extensive laboratory panels. It is a massive, incredibly expensive logistical operation designed to give us a highly accurate cross-sectional snapshot of American health.
And the sample sizes?
The Su et al. Study utilized data from 1,551 men. The Friel study analyzed 4,492 men. These are huge, statistically powerful sample sizes.
And the findings in the Su study just blew my mind regarding the sheer magnitude of the risk. They took these 1,500 men and divided them into 4 quartiles based strictly on their VAI score. Quartile 1 had the lowest visceral fat, and quartile 4 had the highest.
Right.
What they found was that a man in the highest VAI quartile has a 5.07 times higher risk of having clinical testosterone deficiency compared to a man in quartile 1. We are talking about an odds ratio of over 5. That is massive.
It is a staggering association. When you see an odds ratio of 5 in epidemiology, alarm bells should be ringing. But any good statistician or any skeptical listener is going to immediately ask, Could this just be a coincidence?
Right. The classic correlation does not equal causation argument.
Exactly. We know that guys with high visceral fat often have terrible lifestyles. Maybe the men in quartile 4 also smoke 2 packs a day, drink heavily, and have untreated diabetes. Are those lifestyle variables the real culprits, and the visceral fat is just along for the ride?
So maybe it's the beer and the cigarettes tanking the testosterone, not the belly fat itself. How do researchers mathematically prove that the fat is the killer?
To solve that, the researchers use multivariable adjusted linear and logistic regression models. Think of regression models as a way to mathematically level the playing field.
Okay.
In their first pass, Model 1, they adjusted for basic demographics. They mathematically equalized the men based on age, race, and education levels. The association between visceral fat and low testosterone held incredibly strong.
So age wasn't the deciding factor.
Right. But Model 2 is where the analysis becomes truly rigorous. In this model, they adjusted for everything. They controlled for diabetes, hypertension, smoking status, alcohol consumption, and even total BMI.
Wait, so they basically created a mathematical simulation where all the men were assumed to have the exact same lifestyle. They stripped away the effects of the smoking, the drinking, the diabetes, and the overall weight, leaving only the visceral fat isolated.
Yes. They forced the math to look strictly at the visceral fat phenotype in a vacuum. And even after stripping away all those massive lifestyle confounders, the negative impact of the visceral adiposity index on total testosterone remained massive and statistically significant.
That is incredible.
The beta coefficient was negative 11.74. In plain English, a negative beta coefficient means that as the independent variable goes up, the dependent variable goes down in a predictable, mathematically certain way.
So as the fat goes up, the testosterone goes down.
Yes. There is an independent plunge in testosterone driven strictly by the presence of the visceral fat, regardless of whether the man smokes, drinks, or has diabetes.
That totally eliminates the excuses. You can't just blame a bad weekend or a stressful job. The fat itself is doing the damage. And for the data nerds out there, there was a specific statistical tool used in the Friedel and Potter study that really caught my eye.
The restricted cubic splines.
Yes, restricted cubic splines. I have to be honest, I've read a lot of medical papers, and that is a very dense term. What is a restricted cubic spline, and why does it matter for a guy worried about his hormone levels?
It is a dense term, but the concept is actually beautifully simple and incredibly important for how we view health. Often in medicine, we desperately want clear thresholds. We want a magic number.
Right, like if my blood pressure's under 140, I'm healthy.
Exactly. A doctor wants to say, if your blood pressure is under 140, you are healthy. If it's 141, you are sick. We like binary switches. Think of a restricted cubic spline as a highly advanced way to draw a smooth, continuous curve through a massive, messy cloud of thousands of data points without forcing it to be a straight, rigid line. It allows the data to show its natural shape.
So it's looking for the true trend, not an artificial binary cutoff.
Precisely. And when they ran the data through the spline models, what it revealed was a monotonic inverse association across the entire continuous range of visceral adipose tissue.
Okay, monotonic inverse association, meaning as one thing goes up, the other goes down, continuously, without ever stopping or leveling off.
Yes. The curve never flattened out. The spline proved that there is no safe plateau. There is no magical threshold where a little bit of visceral fat is perfectly fine, and then suddenly, at a specific waist size, it becomes toxic.
Wow.
The relationship is a continuous slide. From the very first square centimeter of visceral fat added to the abdomen, the testosterone steadily and reliably decreases. Every ounce of visceral fat is actively working against your endocrine system.
Every single ounce matters. That is a terrifying but honestly very empowering piece of data. Now, they also ran these metrics through another test to see which one was the best at predicting a man's hormonal downfall. They used ROC-AUCs.
The area under the receiver operating characteristic curve.
Right. For anyone who isn't a statistician, think of an ROC-AUC as a grading system for a medical test. A score of 1.0 means the test is a perfect psychic. It perfectly predicts who is sick and who is healthy. A score of 0.5 is literally a coin flip. The test is useless. How did our standard medical metrics perform?
The strongest single predictor they found across the board was HOMA-IR, which is a specialized metric for measuring insulin resistance. HOMA-IR came in with a score of 0.74, which is considered a strong clinical predictor.
Okay, solid.
But right behind it, the visceral adiposity index and the TIG index, which stands for the triglyceride glucose index, came in at 0.66 and 0.67.
So if I'm a doctor and I have a male patient sitting in my exam room complaining of severe fatigue, brain fog, and a complete loss of libido. What do these ROC-AUC scores actually tell me to do?
It tells the clinician that they need to completely shift their diagnostic focus. These statistics definitively prove that glancing at a patient's chart and seeing a BMI under 25 is essentially useless as a guarantee of male metabolic health.
Throw the BMI out.
Completely. It also tells us that relying solely on a basic fasting blood glucose number is inadequate. The VAI and TIG index are vastly superior tools. If we extrapolate this to public health guidelines, the entire narrative must shift from weight loss to fat distribution optimization. We shouldn't just be telling patients to lose weight. We need to be targeting visceral adiposity specifically.
Okay, the math is ironclad. The statistical models have isolated the culprit, but math doesn't cause testosterone to plummet. Biology does.
Very true.
I want to transition into the anatomy of this catastrophe. We've established that visceral fat is a malicious factory, but what is the physical mechanism? How exactly does this belly fat reach up into the brain and down into the testes to destroy a man's hormonal profile?
To truly appreciate the mechanisms at play here, we first have to acknowledge the stakes. I think there is a tendency in popular culture to view testosterone strictly as the muscle-building hormone.
Yeah, we associate it with bodybuilders and aggression.
Exactly. But when a middle-aged man experiences a steep, chemically induced decline in testosterone, it is not just about struggling to add 5 pounds to his bench press. It is a systemic, catastrophic biological breakdown.
The clinical symptoms detailed in these sources are harrowing. We are talking about severe erectile dysfunction, a profound, unsettling loss of libido, reduced reproductive capacity, and sperm quality.
And it goes way beyond the reproductive system.
Right. The cardiovascular risks skyrocket. Men experience deep cognitive issues, severe brain fog, and inability to focus at work, and perhaps most devastatingly, the psychological impacts. The literature closely links this kind of rapid testosterone decline to clinical depression, overwhelming anxiety, and a total loss of vitality and drive. It is an emotional and physical unraveling of the man.
And that unraveling is being systematically orchestrated by what the literature describes as the triple threat of visceral fat. This is the exact biological machinery where the fat transitions from being passive storage into an active pathology. It operates on 3 distinct, devastating pathways.
Let's break down this triple threat because this is where the detective story gets really dark. Let's start with prong 1, the aromatase factory. Earlier, I used the analogy of the fat acting like a hostile corporate takeover. Walk us through how this factory operates on a cellular level.
Visceral fat is uniquely dense with an enzyme called aromatase. To understand the damage this causes, you have to look at the normal manufacturing process. A healthy male body naturally produces testosterone in the testicles.
Right, the natural assembly line.
Right. Once produced, that testosterone is released into the bloodstream to circulate, repair muscle, boost mood, and maintain libido. But as that testosterone-rich blood passes through the capillary networks embedded in the visceral fat tissue, it encounters the aromatase enzyme.
And the aromatase enzyme doesn't just sit there, it is highly reactive. Right?
Highly reactive. Think of aromatase as a rogue worker on an assembly line. As the testosterone floats by, the aromatase literally captures the hormone molecule, breaks a few specific chemical bonds, alters its structure, and chemically converts the male testosterone into estradiol.
And estradiol is?
Estradiol is a highly potent, highly active form of estrogen.
So the visceral fat is literally stealing the host's primary resource. It is taking the male hormone, which took massive biological energy to produce, and chemically transmuting it into the primary female sex hormone.
Yes.
That alone is terrible, but it doesn't just lower the testosterone, it creates a chain reaction in the brain, right?
Yeah, the sabotage doesn't stop at the conversion. The human endocrine system operates on intricate feedback loops. The male brain, specifically the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, acts as a thermostat, constantly monitoring the hormone levels in the blood.
Checking the temperature, so to speak.
Exactly. When the brain senses a sudden, massive spike in circulating estrogen, it gets confused. Biologically, the brain knows that estrogen is a downstream byproduct of testosterone metabolism. So when it sees sky-high estrogen, the brain falsely assumes there must be way too much testosterone in the system.
It thinks the factory is in overdrive.
Exactly. So in a panic to maintain balance, the hypothalamus stops sending the crucial signaling hormones down to the testes. It effectively yells, "Stop production." shut down the assembly line.
Oh, man. So let me get this straight. Not only is the belly fat physically capturing and destroying the testosterone you do have, but by spitting out estrogen, it is actively tricking your brain into shutting down the factory that makes more.
It's blinding the control tower.
That is incredibly insidious, but unfortunately, it gets worse. Let's look at prong 2 of the triple threat: chronic inflammation.
This is where visceral fat fully earns the title of a rogue endocrine gland. Visceral fat doesn't just produce aromatase, it actively manufactures and secretes aggressive, pro-inflammatory cytokines directly into the portal vein and systemic circulation.
What kind of cytokines?
We're talking about heavy-hitting inflammatory markers like interleukin-6, commonly called IL-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNFA, and massive amounts of leptin. Think of these cytokines as molecular static, or better yet, a blaring fire alarm.
Like someone jammed the radio signal between the brain and the body.
Exactly. When these inflammatory cytokines saturate the bloodstream, they travel up to the brain and physically infiltrate the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. This systemic inflammation actively disrupts the HPG axis, the hypothalamic-pituitary-gonadal signaling axis.
So the brain can't talk to the body.
Right. The fire alarms are ringing so loudly, creating so much biological noise, that the delicate pulsating signals the brain normally sends to the testicles simply cannot get through effectively.
So the inflammation is blocking the signal from the top down. But the sources point out that the inflammation also attacks from the bottom up, directly at the source of production. There is a specific protein mentioned called DAX1. How does that fit into the picture?
The inflammatory cytokines also travel down into the testicles themselves, specifically targeting the Leydig cells.
And what do those do?
The Leydig cells are the precise, specialized cellular engines inside the testes that manufacture testosterone from cholesterol. When these cells are bathed in TNFA and IL-6, it induces the expression of the DAX1 protein. You can think of DAX1 as a chemical brake pedal. When it is expressed, it directly, physically inhibits steroidogenesis, the actual biochemical assembly of the testosterone molecule.
So it's basically poisoning the machines on the factory floor. To summarize this so far, the visceral fat acts like a parasite that steals your finished product, jams your communication lines so you can't order more, and then slips a poison into your factory to break the machine.
It is a devastating two-pronged attack, yes.
Which brings us to prong 3, insulin resistance. Now, we touched on HOMA-IR earlier. How does the liver get dragged into this crossfire?
Because of its physical location. Visceral fat physically surrounds and infiltrates the vital organs, particularly the liver. As the visceral fat expands and becomes dysfunctional, it begins to rapidly release free fatty acids directly into the liver's blood supply.
So the liver is just drowning in fat.
Yes, the liver becomes choked with fat. As a survival mechanism, the liver stops responding properly to the insulin circulating in the blood. It becomes insulin resistant.
And when the liver stops listening to insulin, the blood sugar starts to rise.
Yes, and the pancreas panics. It sees the rising blood sugar and assumes it just hasn't sent enough insulin to get the job done. So the pancreas starts pumping out massive, unnatural amounts of insulin to try and force the liver to listen.
It's just yelling louder and louder.
Exactly. This state of chronically high insulin is called hyperinsulinemia. And this exact condition, this excess screaming insulin, is about to have a devastating effect on how testosterone is transported through your body, which leads us to the next critical piece of the puzzle.
This is where the story gets really fascinating, because we're moving from how testosterone is made to how it is delivered. Let's unpack this transport system. We need to follow this hyperinsulinemia directly into the liver to understand a vital protein called SHBG, and we need to look at what these NAA and statistical models might have actually missed.
SHBG stands for Sex Hormone-Binding Globulin. The most important thing to understand about testosterone is that it doesn't just float freely in your bloodstream like salt and water.
Right, it's not water-soluble.
Exactly. It's a fat-based steroid hormone, but it means it isn't very water-soluble. To travel through the watery environment of your blood, it needs a vehicle. SHBG acts as that delivery truck. The vast majority of the testosterone in your body is tightly bound to these SHBG proteins, which safely carry it around to the tissues that need it.
And the liver is the sole manufacturer of these SHBG delivery trucks, right?
Correct. And here is the physiological domino effect that destroys a man's labs. We know visceral fat causes insulin resistance. We know that causes the pancreas to pump out massive amounts of insulin. High levels of insulin have a direct suppressive effect on the liver's ability to produce SHBG.
So the high insulin literally shuts down the delivery truck factory. Your fleet is decimated.
Precisely. And because you have far fewer SHBG delivery trucks in circulation, your total testosterone level plummets.
Wait, so the total number crashes just because of the trucks?
Yes. When a doctor orders a standard total testosterone blood test, they are measuring everything, both the tiny fraction of free-floating hormone and the massive amount of hormone bound up in the SHBG trucks. If the trucks vanish, the total number crashes, even if your testicles are still trying to produce the hormone.
And this is where the statistical breakdown in these studies gets really profound. The researchers took their initial models, the ones predicting testosterone deficiency based on the visceral fat, and they manually added the SHBG levels into the math equation. What happened when they accounted for the delivery trucks?
The explanatory power of the model skyrocketed. In statistics, we use a metric called pseudo-R-squared to determine how much of a mystery our model has actually solved. A score of 0 means we know nothing. A score of 1.0 means we understand the phenomena perfectly.
Okay, so where did they start?
Before adding SHBG, the model's pseudo-R-squared was 0.18. When they added SHBG, it jumped to a massive 0.45.
Wait, meaning that almost half of the entire mystery of why visceral fat lowers testosterone is explained solely by looking at this one specific liver protein. That is incredible.
It proves mathematically that SHBG mediates a huge portion of this relationship, but it also reveals a massive trap for clinicians. Total testosterone tests can absolutely lie to you.
How so? If I'm a patient and my total number is low, isn't that a definitive diagnosis? Don't I need treatment?
Not necessarily, and this is where nuanced medicine is crucial. Because high insulin crushes SHBG, a severely obese man with high visceral fat will almost always return a low total testosterone lab result. His delivery trucks are gone.
Right.
However, his free testosterone, the tiny fraction, usually 1 to 2%, that is unbound, biologically active, and actually entering the cells to do the work, might actually remain temporarily stable. The testicles are still working, there just aren't enough trucks to hold the inventory.
So a doctor who just runs a basic panel, sees a low total number, and doesn't check the free testosterone or the SHBG might make a terrible mistake.
They might drastically overestimate the prevalence of true biochemical hypogonadism. They'll look at the obese man, see a low total number, and immediately prescribe exogenous hormones. But the patient's active hormones might actually be adequate for the moment. It's just the transport proteins that are missing. They are treating a symptom of insulin resistance with a steroid hormone, which is poor medicine.
This perfectly highlights why patients have to be their own advocates and demand the right blood panels, which we will get into later. But before we do, as robust and impressive as these NEA studies are, and they are spectacular, no study is perfect, we need to talk about the blind spots. What are the exclusions and confounders? What did this massive snapshot of American health miss?
This is a vital question when dealing with cross-sectional population data. The biggest limitation of the NEA's protocol is that they rely on single morning blood draws.
Just one draw.
Yeah. They pull a guy into a trailer at 9:00 a.m., take one vial of blood, and that is his data point for the study. The problem is, testosterone is not a static number. It has a massive circadian rhythm. In a healthy man, it surges in the early morning and steadily drops throughout the afternoon and evening. Taking a single snapshot completely ignores those daily physiological variations.
Right. If a guy had a terrible night of sleep, his 9 a.m. draw is going to look disastrous compared to a guy who slept 8 hours. Which brings up lifestyle factors. The math stripped away smoking and drinking, but it didn't strip away the micro-habits, did it?
No, not at all. There's no data in these models regarding sleep architecture or sleep apnea, which is arguably one of the most critical factors for natural testosterone production. A man could theoretically have low visceral fat, but suffer from undiagnosed severe sleep apnea.
And what happens then?
The chronic hypoxia and lack of REM sleep would completely tank his hormones, but the study wouldn't know why. The data also ignores acute illnesses. If a participant had a severe viral infection the week of his blood draw, his inflammatory markers would be sky high and his testosterone would temporarily crash, skewing the data.
And from a strictly endocrine diagnostic perspective, what was missing from the lab panels?
Crucially, the studies lacked gonadotropin data. They didn't measure LH, luteinizing hormone, or FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone.
And those are the specific signaling hormones the brain uses to talk to the testicles, right?
Exactly. Without those brain signals on a lab report, a clinician cannot definitively confirm true hypogonadotropic status. We can see the end result, low testosterone, but without the LH and FSH, we can't definitively pinpoint exactly where the brain-to-testicle communication is breaking down on a population level. We can only infer it from the downstream metabolic carnage.
Okay, so we know the biological mechanisms. The aromatase, the inflammatory fire alarms, the insulin destroying the delivery trucks. We know the superior metrics using VAI and DXA instead of BMI. Now we need to ask, who is falling into this trap and how does the cycle sustain itself? Let's look at the high-risk populations.
The researchers knew they had a massive data set, so they performed a subgroup analysis. They sliced the data apart to see which specific demographics were the most vulnerable to this visceral fat attack.
And what did they find?
What they found was that the negative association between the visceral adiposity index and testosterone was incredibly strong, almost violently correlated in 3 specific groups: men over the age of 60, men with clinical obesity defined by a BMI over 30, and most interestingly, men without diabetes.
Hold on, I need to stop you right there. Men without diabetes, that seems entirely counterintuitive. Based on everything we just discussed about insulin resistance, I would naturally assume the diabetics would be suffering the worst hormonal crash. Why are the non-diabetics showing a stronger correlation?
It is deeply counterintuitive until you look at the timeline of metabolic disease. Think of it this way. A man with full-blown, uncontrolled type 2 diabetes has a metabolic system that is already comprehensively broken.
The damage is done.
Right. The pancreas has exhausted itself. The cellular damage is widespread. The hormonal crash has already happened, and the baseline is low. But a man without diabetes, a man whose system is still desperately fighting a losing battle to maintain normal blood sugar, his body is in a state of hyperreactivity.
Like an engine revving into the red line right before it blows a gasket.
Exactly. His pancreas is pumping out massive compensatory surges of insulin to fight the growing visceral fat. His hormonal axis is highly sensitive to this acute inflammatory and insulin-driven assault. Because his system hasn't fully surrendered yet, the statistical correlation between his rapidly growing visceral fat and his plummeting testosterone appears incredibly sharp, dynamic, and dramatic. The damage is happening in real time.
That is a brilliant explanation. The crash looks steeper because they're currently falling off the cliff, whereas the diabetic has already hit the ground. And what about the other 2 groups? Why are men over 60 and men with a BMI over 30 so vulnerable?
Well, if we look at the older men, natural age-related physiological decline already makes the HPG axis, the delicate brain-testicle connection, much more fragile. Their Leydig cells simply aren't as robust as they were at age 20.
They don't have the same bounce back.
Right, they have less biological reserve. So when you take an aging, fragile system and drop the massive inflammatory and aromatase burden of visceral fat on top of it, it effortlessly tips the scales into clinical deficiency. As for the men with a BMI over 30, the answer is unfortunately a matter of sheer volume.
They just have more of the bad fat.
Yes. They simply possess the highest physical quantity of the toxic fat, meaning their aromatase and cytokine factories are running at maximum capacity.
But this brings up the ultimate biological chicken or egg question, the bidirectional vicious cycle. We know fat and low testosterone go hand in hand, but does low testosterone cause you to get fat, or does the fat cause you to have low testosterone?
It is a phenomenal question, and it is the crux of modern endocrinology. The frustrating yet fascinating answer is, it is absolutely both. It is a bidirectional loop.
A loop.
Yeah. Let's say a man's testosterone drops for a completely independent reason. Perhaps he hits 50 and experiences natural age-related decline. Or he goes through a period of severe psychological stress or chronic sleep deprivation. When testosterone drops, his body fundamentally changes how it partitions energy.
Energy partitioning, meaning how the body decides what to do with the calories you just ate.
Right. High testosterone tells the body to build muscle and store excess calories as harmless subcutaneous fat. But low testosterone changes the blueprints. It causes the body to preferentially store incoming calories, specifically as visceral fat. It drives the fat deep into the abdomen.
So a drop in testosterone literally builds the visceral fat factory.
Yes. And then the trap snaps shut. That newly deposited visceral fat factory powers up its aromatase enzymes. It starts spitting out estrogen. It fires off inflammatory cytokines, which, as we spent the last 20 minutes discussing, forcefully suppresses natural testosterone production even further.
So they feed on each other.
Exactly. The lower the testosterone goes, the more visceral fat is stored. The more visceral fat is stored, the lower the testosterone goes. It is a self-sustaining downward spiral, and it is incredibly difficult to break out of once it gains momentum.
So if it's a perfect loop, how do we know for sure which one came first in these NAS participants? Can these studies actually prove causality?
They cannot. And this highlights a crucial research gap in the current literature, because NAAS is a cross-sectional snapshot. It just looks at thousands of people in one random Tuesday. It mathematically cannot definitively prove causality.
Right, you're just seeing a freeze frame.
Exactly. To truly map this out, the scientific community desperately needs future longitudinal studies and highly controlled randomized controlled trials, or RCTs.
What would that look like? How do you prove it?
We need to track a cohort of men over several years. We need to implement protocols that target the reduction of only the visceral adipose tissue, perhaps through highly specific pharmaceuticals, and see if that strictly restores the HBG axis function independent of overall weight loss. Until we have that longitudinal data tracking men over time, we can only observe the correlation, understand the mechanisms, and try to break the cycle.
Which perfectly transitions us to the most important part of this deep dive, the solutions. We have established the severity of the problem. We have mapped the anatomy of the catastrophe. We know who is at risk. Now, how do clinicians and listeners actually fix this? What are the actionable clinical protocols and dietary tactics to dismantle the factory?
The clinical implications here are profound, and they demand a paradigm shift in how doctors treat men. Historically, when a middle-aged man walks into an endocrinology clinic complaining of severe fatigue, loss of libido, and depression, and his blood work shows a low total testosterone level, the knee-jerk reaction for decades has been to write a prescription for external testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT.
Right. It seems logical on the surface, right? The patient is missing a hormone, so you give him the hormone. You give him a cream or an injection to bring the levels back up. What is wrong with that approach?
If you understand the biological mechanisms we just spent the entire deep dive unpacking, you realize that giving standard TRT to a man loaded with visceral fat is like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Gasoline on a fire. How so?
If you inject exogenous testosterone into a body that is highly concentrated with aromatase enzymes, a massive portion of that expensive TRT is just going to convert straight into estrogen. You might end up giving the man terrible estrogenic side effects like gynecomastia or severe water retention while barely fixing his testosterone.
You are literally feeding the factory more raw materials to turn into estrogen. And it also destroys his natural production, right?
Yes, permanently in some cases.
Yeah.
When you introduce external testosterone, the brain senses that there's plenty of hormone in the blood, so it completely shuts down the internal assembly line. The Leydig cells go dormant, and the testes physically shrink.
So the doctor is treating a symptom, but making the underlying biological machinery infinitely worse. What is the alternative?
The focus must shift from hormone replacement to aggressive visceral fat reduction strategies. The goal should be to reverse what we call functional hypogonadism.
Meaning it's not permanently broken.
Right. The system isn't permanently broken. It's just being suppressed by the fat. For severe clinically obese cases, this might mean aggressive pharmacological interventions. Things like the new class of GLP-1 agonists, which have shown incredible efficacy at specifically targeting and draining visceral fat stores, or, in extreme cases, bariatric surgery. The medical priority must be to resuscitate the man's natural endocrine system by removing the toxic fat that is suffocating it, rather than just chemically papering over the problem with TRT.
And for the men who aren't clinical candidates for GLP-1s or surgery, who want to attack this through lifestyle, nutrition, and sheer willpower, the Happy Science source provided a phenomenal breakdown. They didn't just guess at what works. They reviewed a Prisma standard meta-analysis of 52 separate scientific studies comparing 3 popular diets and their direct impact on male testosterone levels across a massive pool of over 5,000 men.
The fact that this is a Prisma standard meta-analysis is vital.
What does Prisma stand for exactly?
It stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. It means this isn't just an influencer cherry-picking 3 studies on YouTube that support his supplement brand. It is a highly rigorous, systematic review that threw out hundreds of poorly designed, biased trials and only looked at gold standard data.
Okay, so let's break down the actual diet results from the meta-analysis. The first one they looked at is the heavy hitter, the most controversial, but arguably the most effective in the short term. The ketogenic diet, specifically very low-calorie keto, we are talking about restricting carbohydrates to under 50 grams a day. What does the data say?
The physiological mechanism of keto in this specific context is fascinating. By virtually eliminating carbohydrates, you force the body to completely exhaust its stored glycogen. Once the glycogen is gone, the body is forced into a state of ketosis, meaning it must utilize fat for primary fuel. When this happens, the body rapidly mobilizes and burns visceral fat.
And when the visceral fat burns, the aromatase burden vanishes.
Exactly. The factory is dismantled. Furthermore, because you are eating zero carbs, your insulin levels plummet to baseline and stay there. We know that high insulin suppresses SHBG delivery trucks. So when the insulin drops, the liver is finally free to rapidly scale up production of SHBG, restoring the transport network.
But there was a highly specific, almost sci-fi neurological mechanism mentioned in the sources regarding keto, right? It wasn't just about the fat loss.
Yes, and this is cutting-edge endocrinology. When you're in deep ketosis, your liver produces primary ketone bodies, the most prevalent being beta-hydroxybutyrate. There's compelling preliminary evidence suggesting that these specific ketones can cross the blood-brain barrier and directly stimulate the hypothalamus.
Wait, the ketones themselves act as a signaling molecule.
Exactly. They don't just provide fuel. They may actually enhance the neurological signal being sent down to the testes, actively increasing the command to produce testosterone.
The clinical results in the meta-analysis were undeniable. The keto diet yielded the highest absolute testosterone increase of all the diets tested, a massive bump of 1.5 to 3.0 nmol/LO. That can be the difference between feeling exhausted and feeling 25 again. But as with all biology, nothing is free. What is the downside of keto?
The downsides are severe, which is why it's highly controversial.
Yeah.
The side effects during the adaptation phase are brutal. The keto flu, profound electrolyte imbalances, massive fatigue, and brain fog, while the brain transitions to using ketones.
It sounds miserable.
It can be. And, crucially, looking at the behavioral data, it is incredibly difficult for a normal person to sustain long-term. You are essentially removing an entire macronutrient from your life. The clinical consensus derived from this data is that keto is an incredibly powerful acute intervention. It is a tactical strike to rapidly drain the visceral fat and break the vicious cycle. But for most men, it is not a sustainable lifelong dietary strategy. You use it for 3 to 4 months to fix the chemistry and then transition.
If you're listening to this and thinking, great, I have to give up carbs and eat butter forever to save my hormones, there's good news. You don't. Because the second tool the meta-analysis looked at is much more flexible: intermittent fasting. Specifically, the 16-8 protocol, where you fast for 16 hours and eat all your meals in an 8-hour window, or the 5-2 protocol. What were the results here?
Intermittent fasting yielded a solid, moderate testosterone increase, roughly 0.8 to 1.6 Decenons tortoise. The biological mechanism here isn't magic, and it doesn't rely on crossing the blood-brain barrier with ketones. It works largely via organic calorie reduction.
Just by compressing the time you're allowed to eat, you naturally end up eating fewer calories.
Yes. And because you are fasting for 16 hours, your insulin levels remain very low for 2/3 the day, allowing the liver to recover and inflammation to subside. You are giving the digestive and endocrine systems a massive daily break.
But the downside here isn't chemical, it's human nature.
Precisely. It is highly individual. Because you are still eating carbs, it produces a much lower SHBG boost than keto. And frankly, behavioral studies show it is very easy for a man to severely overeat during his 8-hour feeding window, completely negating the metabolic benefits of the 16-hour fast. If you eat 3,000 calories of junk food between noon and 8 p.m., you are still going to build visceral fat.
Which brings us to the final diet analyzed in the massive PRISMA study, the Mediterranean diet. Heavy on olive oil, fish, lean meats, vegetables, and complex carbohydrates, the long-term shield. Now, looking at the numbers, this diet performed terribly in the short term, didn't it?
If your only goal is to actively and rapidly raise your testosterone levels from a state of deficiency, the Mediterranean diet is actually very poor. The meta-analysis showed a meager 0.5 to 1.2 nmol increase, and frankly, in many of the underlying studies, that increase wasn't even statistically significant. It could have easily just been a margin of error.
So why is it even in the meta-analysis? Why are we talking about it?
Because treating metabolic disease is a two-step process. You have to cure it, and then you have to maintain it. The Mediterranean diet is the absolute best dietary protocol in the world for maintaining results over a human lifespan.
Ah, okay.
Once a man has utilized a targeted, aggressive intervention, like a few months of keto, strict fasting, or a GLP-1 agonist to strip away the toxic visceral fat and reset the endocrine system, the Mediterranean diet is the ultimate shield. It dramatically reduces systemic inflammation, heavily supports cardiovascular health, and most importantly, it is highly palatable and culturally sustainable for decades.
It's the siege mentality. You use the heavy artillery of keto or fasting to breach the wall and destroy the factory, and once the territory is secure, you use the Mediterranean diet to hold the castle for the rest of your life.
Exactly. It is a phased approach to metabolic health.
All right, this has been an incredible amount of dense PhD-level science, from statistics to molecular biology. We need to distill this into highly actionable steps for the listener. If a guy is listening to this in his car right now and thinks, this is me, I have the dad bod, I have the brain fog, I am exhausted, what does he do tomorrow? Step 1, demand the right tests. When you go to your doctor, do not accept a simple total testosterone test. You have to politely but firmly ask for a full panel that includes free testosterone, SHBG, LH, and FSH. You have to know how many delivery trucks you have, and you have to know if the brain is even sending the signal.
Step 2, the mirror test. You don't necessarily need to pay for an expensive DXA scan to know if you are in the danger zone. You can do this at home. Take a tape measure. Measure your height in inches, then measure your waist circumference at the belly button. If your waist circumference is more than half of your total height, you very likely have a clinically significant visceral fat issue, regardless of what your BMI says.
So if you are 72 inches tall, 6 feet, and your waist is over 36 inches, the alarm bells should be ringing. And step 3, the rule of thumb from the meta-analysis. For motivation, remember the math. Losing roughly 10 kilograms of pure fat, which is about 22 pounds, correlates to an automatic biological increase of about 3 bertamel in your natural testosterone levels. You can physically rebuild your hormone profile by burning the fat.
Yeah, that's incredibly empowering.
When we look at the totality of this data, what does it all mean? It means that for the vast majority of men, your hormonal destiny isn't necessarily a genetic life sentence. That feeling of exhaustion and weakness isn't just getting older. For millions of men, this devastating loss of energy and vitality is a completely reversible metabolic state.
It is entirely within your control to alter the biochemical environment of your own body. You are not a victim of your age. You are in many ways a reflection of your adipose tissue.
Let's recap this massive journey. We started by completely redefining how we view obesity, tossing the 19th century BMI out the window and embracing the visceral adiposity index and DXA-derived imaging. We unpacked the dense, multivariable statistical models from N.A. Janney's, proving mathematically that visceral fat, independently of all lifestyle factors, is linked to testosterone collapse.
Right.
We mapped the horrifying 3-pronged biological attack, the aromatase factory stealing the hormone, the inflammatory cytokines jamming the brain signals, and the hyperinsulinemia destroying the SHBG delivery trucks. And finally, we walked through the practical, clinical, and phased dietary interventions to fight back.
And as we look to the horizon of endocrinology, I want to leave you with one final, highly provocative thought to mull over. We've established today that visceral fat truly acts as an independent, hostile endocrine organ. It is a rogue factory producing aromatase and cytokines. Currently, our only solution is to physically burn the factory down through diet or drugs. But what if the future of medicine isn't about replacing hormones, or even forcing rapid weight loss? What if future therapies, perhaps utilizing highly specific genetic editing or targeted molecular inhibitors, could selectively turn off the aromatase and cytokine production specifically inside the visceral fat cells?
Wait, you are saying, what if we could leave the fat physically in the body, but chemically lobotomize it?
Precisely. Could we one day chemically silence the malicious behavior of the fat, instantaneously rescuing the male hormone profile and reversing the inflammation before the patient even has to undergo the grueling process of burning the fat off?
Now, that is a wild sci-fi thought. Curing the parasite by turning it back into a harmless pantry, without having to evict it first.
It would completely change the entire paradigm of how humanity approaches metabolic disease and aging.
Well, until that miraculous sci-fi future arrives in our pharmacies, we have the dietary and clinical tools right now to take back control of our own biology. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take this knowledge, challenge your doctors, rethink the metrics you use to judge your own reflection, and apply these new physiological perspectives to your own health journey. Keep diving deep.
You have the data, you have the mechanism. Now, it's about clinical application. Stop chasing symptoms and start addressing the primary pathology. If you're a clinician or a patient, focus on the visceral depot. Reach out for the full breakdown and deep dive analysis. Stay at the cutting edge. See you in the next session.